You were taught that Europe discovered Africa, but Europe repeatedly arrived, asking for permission instead. That contradiction alone should unsettle the timeline you inherited, because discovery does not require treaties, payments, or diplomatic hostilities. Yet European archives are filled with negotiations, not proclamations, and those documents describe African states as sovereign, organized, and strategically indispensable. This history was not hidden because it was unclear. It was removed because it disrupted the hierarchy. We were told power flowed in one direction. The record shows it did not. What Europe encountered across Africa were governments capable of refusal. That reality created a problem historians would later solve with silence. But silence only works if no one checks the paper trail. And the paper trail still exists, just rarely taught. The first clue is not conquest, it is protocol. European envoys did not march into African capitals unannounced. They waited, they presented gifts, they followed court customs, they barely understood. African rulers controlled access to land, trade, and labor, and Europe needed all three. This is where the familiar story begins to fracture, because dependence reverses the assumed balance of power. And dependence is exactly what European states recorded privately. West African kingdoms regulated gold exports with calculated precision. European currencies depended on that gold to stabilize domestic markets. This is forced negotiation, not domination. And that arrangement lasted centuries longer than textbooks admit. But that explanation doesn't survive scrutiny unless documentation supports it. It dos. Portuguese royal correspondence describes African kings as necessary partners. Necessary is not the language of conquest. It is the language of vulnerability. Consider the Kingdom of Kongo. European missionaries did not convert the Congo. Congo invited them on its own terms. Christianity was adapted, regulated, and embedded within existing political authority. European priests answered to African kings. That relationship unsettled European hierarchies back home, because it inverted the assumed civilizational flow. So later, historians reframed it as inevitable submission. But contemporary letters show active governance, not collapse. And this is where the record abruptly shifts, not because Congo weakened, but because European expansion required a different narrative, one that justified intervention rather than cooperation. The same pattern appears further east. In Ethiopia, Europe did not arrive as a conqueror. Europe arrived as a petitioner. Ethiopia controlled the Red Sea access routes critical to European trade with Asia. European states needed an Ethiopian alliance to bypass Islamic intermediaries, so they negotiated, repeatedly, and unsuccessfully. Ethiopia dictated terms that Europe could not enforce otherwise. That reality forced European chroniclers into contradiction. They described Ethiopia as ancient, Christian, and powerful, then later described as isolated and backward. Those descriptions cannot both be true, but they coexist in the record. Because one justified alliance, the other justified erasure. What followed was acknowledged privately, but excluded publicly. European maps quietly removed Ethiopian influence from surrounding regions, not by accident, by editorial decision. Cartography became narrative enforcement. Lines shifted, names changed. Authority vanished from the paper. This was not ignorance, it was a strategy, and the same strategy appears along the Swahili Coast. City-states like Kilwa controlled Indian Ocean commerce for centuries. Europe did not dominate that system. Europe rented access. Portuguese fleets paid tariffs enforced by African authorities. Those payments are itemized in European ledgers, which means Europe recognized African jurisdiction. Jurisdiction implies sovereignty. That should end the debate. Instead, it vanished from curricula, because sovereignty challenges empire, and the empire required justification. But the most destabilizing evidence comes from treaties themselves. Europe signed treaties recognizing African states as equals. Those treaties remain archived. They specify borders, obligations, and enforcement mechanisms. You cannot sign equality into existence accidentally. Yet modern narratives describe Africa as politically absent. That absence was manufactured retroactively because treaties became inconvenient once power shifted. So their context was stripped. Their implications are ignored. Their language soft or omitted entirely. This is not speculation. It is an observable pattern. Recognition was granted when needed, then revoked when no longer useful. That revocation required silence, not force, because force leaves evidence. Silence erases it. The Asante Empire provides another fracture point. Britain did not immediately colonize Asante. Britain negotiated repeatedly. Asante controlled gold production, which Britain needed for industrial expansion. Military confrontation was avoided because Britain could not afford disruption. So treaties were signed acknowledging Asante's authority. Those treaties appear in British parliamentary records until they stop appearing. Not because Asante vanished, but because Britain's leverage increased. At that moment, the narrative shifted. Asante transformed from partner to obstacle, from sovereign to subject. Not in reality. On paper, this is how erasure works. First recognition, then reinterpretation, then institutional silence. By the time the conquest occurred, the record had already been prepared, which means domination followed narrative, not the other way around. And that should reframe everything, because power is not only enforced militarily, it is rehearsed administratively. And this is where the modern consequence begins to surface. Educational systems inherit edited archives, not raw ones. Curricula reflect what institutions preserved, not what occurred, which explains why African diplomacy is rarely taught, while European expansion is described as inevitable. Inevitability absolves decision. Negotiation exposes choice, and choice implies responsibility. So responsibility was removed, not with lies, with omissions, and those omissions hardened into common knowledge. But common knowledge collapses under archival pressure, because documents do not forget what classrooms omit. And this is the pivot point historians avoid. Because if African states were recognized, negotiated, and depended upon, then their later disappearance from narratives requires explanation, not an assumption. And that explanation leads somewhere uncomfortable. It leads to institutional decisions made deliberately across universities, publishing houses, and state archives, to narrow history until power appeared linear. And once linear, it became teachable. What happens next in the record is not a collapse. African kingdoms were not defeated first. They were redefined first, from states to tribes, from rulers to chiefs, from diplomacy to folklore. That transformation did not happen organically. It required consensus, and consensus leaves fingerprints. Those fingerprints become visible only when the negotiation era is acknowledged, because negotiation contradicts the myth of European inevitability, and that contradiction cannot remain unresolved, which is why the record tightens. Precisely here, Justas Africa as leverage peaks, just as European dependence becomes undeniable, just as the story should get more complex. Instead, it goes quiet, and that silence is not the end of the story. It is the setup, because what replaced negotiation was not sudden conquest. It was something far more calculated, something institutional, something systematic. And once that shift begins, nothing written afterward can be read innocently. That systematic shift did not announce itself with armies. It announced itself with paperwork. European powers began redefining African authority through legal language, not immediate violence. Customary law was selectively interpreted, then selectively dismissed. Existing governance structures were labeled informal, then invalid. This allowed treaties to be reclassified retroactively as misunderstandings, not breaches, miscommunications. That reframing mattered, because breach implies accountability. Miscommunication implies innocence. This distinction became policy. Colonial offices formalized it through administrative codes. African rulers were no longer counterparts. They were now intermediaries. That single reclassification collapsed centuries of diplomatic parity, and it happened quietly. European legal scholars began debating African sovereignty without African participation. Those debates filled journals. They shaped doctrine. Doctrine shaped law. Law justified expansion. This was not a conquest first. It was a consensus first. Once consensus was solidified, force followed as enforcement, not initiation. That sequence matters, because it explains why resistance was later framed as rebellion. You cannot rebel against a partner, only against a subject. So subject thought had to be established in advance. This is where institutions become visible. Universities standardized imperial legal theory. Publishing houses filtered acceptable historical interpretations. Archives reorganized collections around European administrative needs. African-authored documents were reclassified as ethnography, not a political record. That decision alone reshaped perception, because ethnography implies observation, not authority. Governance documents became cultural artifacts. Treaties became curiosities, and sovereignty disappeared without being disproven. This was not accidental. It required coordination across institutions that claimed neutrality. Neutrality became the shield, because neutral institutions are rarely questioned. But neutrality still makes choices, and those choices accumulate. By the time formal colonization accelerated, the narrative groundwork was complete. Africa appeared ungoverned on paper, so governance could be imposed. That appearance was manufactured, and the manufacturing left records. Minutes from colonial conferences describe Africa as administratively vacant. Vacancy is not observation. It is a classification, because vacancy ignores existing systems by definition. That definition unlocked legal seizure. Land could be claimed because sovereignty was declared absent, not defeated. Absent. This distinction protected the European self, because conquest implies aggression. Administration implies order. Order sounds necessary, and necessity erases guilt. But the contradictions persisted beneath the surface. European companies still negotiated locally, still paid tolls, still relied on African logistical networks, even while declaring those networks non-existent. This dual reality was never reconciled publicly, because reconciliation would expose fabrication. Instead, it was compartmentalized. Official narratives spoke of control. Operational documents admitted dependence. Those operational documents were archived quietly, not destroyed, just buried, which is why they surfaced only when deliberately sought, and deliberate seeking was discouraged institutionally. Funding followed safe research paths. Safe paths avoided destabilizing conclusions. So, a generation of scholars inherited boundaries without being told they existed. This is how silence perpetuates itself, not through censorship, through incentive. The modern education system reflects this inheritance. Textbooks summarize outcomes, not negotiations. Maps show borders, not processes. Students learn results without mechanisms, which makes power appear natural. Rather than being constructed, the media reinforces this structure unconsciously. Documentaries focus on spectacle, not administration. Battles are shown. Treaties are skipped, because treaties complicate moral simplicity. They imply mutual recognition, and recognition disrupts the savior narrative, so it is avoided, not debated. Avoidance is more effective than denial, because it feels neutral. But neutrality still selects, and selection shapes memory. Public memory now associates African power with exception, not nor. Ethiopia becomes an anomaly. Asante becomes temporary. Congo becomes tragic. But patterns are not anomalies. They are systems, and systems leave consistency across regions, which is exactly what the record shows. Negotiation everywhere in Europe lacked leverage. Reclassification once leverage shifted. Silence once control was secure. This pattern repeats too cleanly to be a coincidence. Yet coincidence is implied by omission, because omission avoids accusation. An accusation would require a response, so instead, curricula remain narrow, archives remain quiet, and the public absorbs a simplified arc. Africa appears as a prelude. Europe appears as an engine. Modern inequality appears inevitable, but inevitability dissolves when contingency is exposed. And contingency is everywhere in these records. Moments where Europe hesitated. Moments where Africa dictated. Moments where outcomes were undecided. Those moments threaten deterministic history, which is why they are minimized, not erased entirely, just disconnected, so they never accumulate into a challenge. Until viewed together, that is when the discomfort sets in, because the question becomes unavoidable. If African states were recognized, negotiated with, and depended upon, why are they remembered as passive? The answer is not forgetfulness. It is authorship. History is written through institutional permission, and permission followed power. Once Europe controlled archives physically, it controlled them narratively. Classification systems favored imperial logic. Cataloging reflected colonial priorities. What was not useful was sidelined. What was threatening was contextualized away, and what contradicted progress narratives was fragmented. So no single document tells the whole story, but together they reconstruct it, which is precisely what standard education prevents. Fragmentation protects the frame. Integration dismantles it, and dismantling reveals continuity into the present. Modern borders still follow colonial administrative lines. Modern conflicts trace back to imposed classifications. Modern media still frames African agency as a reaction, not an initiation. These are not separate issues. They are downstream effects. of narrative decisions made generations ago. Decisions that prioritized coherence over accuracy and authority over truth. The unsettling part is not that this happened. Power always curates memory. The unsettling part is how effectively it worked. Because most people never suspect omission. They suspect bias only when statements are made. Silence feels objective, but silence is constructed. And once you recognize that, every absence becomes a question. Why was this not included? Who benefited from its exclusion? And what else was filtered the same way? Those questions are not answered in textbooks. They are deferred indefinitely, because answering them destabilizes legitimacy, not just of empires, but of modern narratives built upon them, which is why this history remains unresolved. Not because evidence is lacking, but because resolution carries consequences, and the consequences rarely volunteered by institutions, so the discomfort remains, unaddressed, inherited, and quietly enforced through repetition, until someone notices the pattern, and once noticed, it cannot be unseen.